Hi there. My name is David Yun, and I've built this podcast for all of us photographers looking for some extra inspiration. Every Friday, I interview local photographers about the how and the why behind their projects, and at the end of each episode, I add a thought or a challenge for both of us to consider as we continue our pursuit of awesome photography. You can help me keep this project growing by sharing this podcast with your photo-loving friends and by subscribing and leaving a review or a rating on your podcast platform of choice. Ultimately, the goal is to stir up conversation and thoughtfulness about photography as a practice, and I wanted to start each episode with a thank you. Your attention and focus on these artists and these conversations help the community at large keep growing. So, without further ado, welcome to my viewfinder. This week I sit down with Ashley Nixon, instructor at Mount Royal University. Ashley holds a PhD in ecology and has worked in education, research, as well as in the private sector. But more relevant to us, he's been working with a camera since his youth. He's primarily focused on building narratives around the environment, culture, and social change. His work brought him around the world, but he ultimately connected with the native cultures in Peru. And I'm about to learn how his profound search for sharing his experiences with the people there has driven him into becoming a documentarian through images, words, as well as through film. How about what is the most beautiful sight you've ever seen? Easy and difficult.
I would actually making a choice about what's the most beautiful place I've ever seen is really, really hard. Because I've traveled to the Arctic, I've worked in the Arctic, I've worked and traveled in the Amazon jungle, I've worked in the Andes of Peru. And so there's just spectacular landscapes that I've seen. And I've also had the privilege to visit many bustling, complicated cities. So I don't think I have a single answer, but if I can get close to a single answer, I must admit that the first time I saw Machu Picchu, which is the big Inca ruins on the outskirts of the Amazon jungle, just in the lower region of the Andes. And it's spectacular and it lives up to its reputation. And it's interesting because as a photographer now, you see these iconic places and you see them so much on Instagram and social media and you get bored with them. But actually physically being there and the effort that it took to travel by train from Cusco down the Urubamba River Valley and then take a bus up and up and up, and then to be there when the mist is over the mountains and you can't see Machu Picchu, then suddenly it moves away and you get that glimpse. That's absolutely stunning.
The lived-in experience.
Exactly. Just you've got to experience it, and that's one of the great things about being a photographer, that you're experiencing, you're exploring what is going on there, and then it's impressing you, and then you're thinking, well, how might this impress an audience? How can you relay what you are experiencing via a two-dimensional image?
And what is your experience with that? I mean, do you think that in principle photography does that justice? Is it something that can be intentionally relayed, or is it ultimately for you, like even when you look at a photograph that you've taken in a situation, are you brought back to that moment, or does it change its context and its perspective, perhaps over time or over the next series of life experiences? I'd like to find out what you did prior to pushing so much into photography, because it sounds like you've traveled the world, in a career or personal journeys that are outside of photography. But as a photographer, do you think that so let's talk about Machu Picchu. I don't know if you had your camera the first time you're up there, but if you had a picture of it, does it do it justice really? Or is it more nostalgic and just remind you of your personal experience with it?
Well, I think my own work apart, that if you look at the great photographs, the very best of photography, you're not just seeing images, you're feeling them. And that there has to be a resonation with you as an individual. And that punctum, as it's been called, that someone, in this case myself, I see a photograph and I can relate to it, and it takes me to a memory, takes me to a feeling, a sensation, and there is a crossover to that two-dimensional image. So the best of photography really does work like that. when it comes to my own experience of, to your question about Machu Picchu, I think some of those photographs do work on that feeling level. I've been to Machu Picchu twice, and both times with my camera. And the first time I went, it was very wet indeed. And I thought my camera was going to pack up. So I was continuously taking it, putting it under my jacket, and then bringing it out, cleaning it up, taking the photographs. And so there are a lot of photographs that show a lot of intense rain. And the family members, my wife and my kids and my mother-in-law. And I've got all these photographs of them looking dripping wet. Their hair is wet, they've got anoraks on and so on. And you can almost see the steam coming off their bodies. It really does resonate.
My Viewfinder is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network is a program to support Albertan podcasts by connecting us with local businesses and initiatives to keep our stories and our interests at the fore. If you're interested in finding more Albertan podcast content in a wide range of topics, check out their website, albertapodcastnetwork.com, or you can connect with them over social media. They are at Alberta Podnet on both Instagram and Twitter. This week I've got a message for you from Rumi. Cold drafts, flickering lights, and where's that leak coming from? If you've ever wondered what's really going on in your home, Rumi's Ask a Home Inspector service can help. Connect with a certified professional home inspector by phone or video call and get your questions answered. Rumi will let you know what's easily fixable with a little DIY, or when you might need to call some professional help. Visit rumi.ca, that's RUMI.ca, and book your Ask a Home Inspector appointment today. Outside of having been there and being the one who's taken the photos, how often, I guess my point is this, my point of questioning is that often when I am shown or told that a photograph historically has some impact or significance, it doesn't resonate with me that much. And I, just because of my person, I'm pretty vocal about it. And it is largely why this podcast exists, because I'm questioning this idea of, the connection between lived experience, reality, and as you put it, this two-dimensional object. I mean, three-dimensional, but, the image is flat, it's on a single perspective, but it can be packed with meaning. Do we get to control that, etc.? So it is fascinating to start off in traveling the Amazon, Machu Picchu, urban dense areas, the Arctic. These are all fundamentally different environments. So yeah, you have clearly a wealth of imagery to draw from. And from what little I know of you, Ashley, you've tried to share that with a lot of folks around, both through online and published material. I, for my part, am not sure if I connect with people the way I think I do with my photography. I'd like to believe I do. So I don't know. I'm just trying to understand your experience of that, and how much feedback you've actually got back on the impact of the images that you're living in, and then what they've been interpreted as by your audience.
Well, I've been photographing for a long time, and I've gone through the age of analog photography, and I used to take a lot of slide photography back in the 1980s. I think my first camera was a Praktika, and then I got a Russian camera and progressed from there. But back in the 1980s, I was using my camera for the purpose of research and for the purposes of teaching. And so back then, I mean, I'm an environmentalist. I actually trained in that my PhD is in ecology. I used to be a university lecturer in Britain. I'm now teaching at Mount Royal University on sustainability issues. And it's been my whole career, whether it's been in academia or in consultancy or working for companies. In one way or another, it's been actually usually quite firmly attached to sustainability issues, whether that's conservation management or it's about climate change, biodiversity. And then I did spend a lot of time working on this social agenda, heritage and culture and health and education and all of these very important subjects. And so the camera has always been actually, for most of my life, it's been part of what I did. And so it's an extension of my perspectives on life, really. So it's like part of the life process. And because I had the privilege of traveling around the world for work, visited more than 30 countries and stayed there. And sometimes it'd be only a few days, like going to South Korea just for a weekend sort of thing for a conference. But in other places, I spent 4 years living in Peru. I spent 3 years going in and out of Nigeria, making 10, 12-week visits, for work. And so experienced those places intimately and wanting to capture that record using whatever camera I had at the time. I mean, right now, I've got this huge analog collection of slides that I've started to digitize. For example, in my latest book, Cobbled Together, that I went back to those 1980s photographs. And I guess the storyline there is that the camera and what it creates, imagery that comes out of that equipment, is an extension of how I see the world.
And what is it that we see? I mean, you've been doing this for 40 some odd years in ecology, which is fascinating. So there's, a larger, I suppose, concept's evolutionary, but you've seen quite a lot of change, I'm sure. I often muse about how when I was a kid in the 80s, I think we used to learn there was 4 billion people on the earth, and now we're closing in on 8. And we all know on the public eye about all the impact we've had on our world. So through both a researcher and a photographer's eye, especially now that you're going through your historical slides and like kind of backtracking through how you've documented and experienced the world, what's that been like? Like what context and perspectives are you seeing about where we're at right now?
I'm definitely fascinated by environmental change, whether that's to do with landscape, the look of a landscape, which is a function of the vegetation, and forestation, deforestation. That's an obvious example. But when you get to environmental change like climate change, it's really hard to pin that down. And that's one of the reasons why we are struggling so much in the world to actually tackle the issue, because it's intangible. We don't feel that temperature change because it's going on too slowly for us. When I first went to Peru, and that was in 1995, and I went in for specific projects. And then in 1997, I started to live there. But that very first time I went to Peru, and I was there for 1 week, there with my camera, and I took photographs, and because we're taking slide photography, I've probably got 3 rolls of film in my bag for the whole of that time. Very, very limited. And it is interesting to reflect back to how photography used to be done, even in my time, that you were very selective, that you were very careful about your exposures, you were very careful about your backgrounds, and you had to decide which photographs am I going to take before I run out of film. And I think that's a really good training, even in, for the digital age, that you're thinking about compositions, you're thinking about the stories that those photographs ultimately should be telling. I'm very driven by the narrative that's captured with a photograph, as opposed to film, which is easier to do, but it's much more challenging with a single photograph. But back then, I went to, and this is one example of it. I went to this community called Manchay, and Manchay is to the south of Lima. Now, Lima is a massive city, 9 million people there, and growing. And you have what we call shanty towns, or informal communities that are established around that city, and it's just growing out and out. Now, Lima is on the Pacific coast of Peru, and it's a desert strip, which goes from Chile all the way up through Peru. And so unless it's a river coming down off the Andes, it's dry desert, completely dry. There isn't any water there. And so that land is not, historically, is not being used, because it doesn't have that commercial value because the water is not there. So the people that, for various reasons, political reasons, that they were driven off the mountains and tried to establish a new place to live in Lima, they were pushed out to these poorer areas in the desert and set up shacks to live in. And Manchay is one of the best examples of this kind of community that 30 years ago, but only something like probably about 10 or so years before I first arrived, there were absolutely no one living there. There was no water, there was no roads, there was no access to transportation. And they would build these, use wickerwork, little pieces, a couple of meters wide, 4 pieces, bind them together, put another one on the top, and they've got a box. And then over time, they would buy bricks and then stack them dry around those boxes, and then get a bit more money, buy a bag of cement, create a strong structure. But all of that time, those people were having to buy water from tankers coming in down these dusty roads to buy their water and survive. And then they'd get on a bus, and it would take them an hour and a half or more to get into the city to sell things on the street. So 30 years ago, no one living there. And now there's 200,000 people and more. And so you've had this explosion of urban development. And when I first went there in 1995, I took some photographs. And then I kept going back to this place because my wife was working for a non-governmental organization, an NGO, concerned with development issues and promoting sustainable development in these communities. She was a community worker working on health and water issues and to do with food as well. And she would work with engineers in these communities to create access to water. And that would include, amongst other things, it included actually drilling a well down to the water table, and for the first time providing water for a community in this same area. And it transformed that community. They had potable, clean water that they hadn't had before. So, kids are dying of diarrhea, big time in places like Peru. And, why should kids die of diarrhea? It's absurd, isn't it, for us living in Canada? But by bringing in a pump and putting the pump into work to bring up water, it transformed the health of those people. It transformed the community economy, because one of the people that I took photographs of over the years had a dairy farm, and he was able to expand his dairy farm, sell milk to market because he now had running water for his cattle. So it was a real privilege to go back and revisit and go to see these people that I'd seen and had a small conversation with in the past. And they said, look, I've got this idea of a book. Can we take some more photographs? And to have the photographs from 20 years previously and then others that show this transformation was really a privilege to do.
And so when we build that book, I mean, even just, as we're terming it, editing and sequencing and kind of building a narrative that we want an audience to see, how do you find it is to assess, let's say, the emotional impact or the desired story out of still images? I mean, there's a comparative thing because you do have this great expanse of 20 years. But do you think that, what is it that you found makes an image impactful in this story? So it's a story that seems to be about hope, about a charitable and well-meaning people coming to share technology with an area where people really require it to survive, and the positive impacts. I mean, this is at least what I'm getting from the parts of the story that I'm learning from you, because I think we're sidestepping some of the political problems in South America and all of that kind of fun stuff. So we're going to build projects. So.
Well, it's the fundamentals of life, isn't it? Yeah. It's all political. Everything is political, really. Climate change is political. Providing access to water, it's not an environmental issue, it's a political issue. But you can manage and play out stories or narratives at a person level. It doesn't have to be, I mean, photographs of politicians making decisions in chambers is boring as hell, right? It really is. I mean, there are photographers that do that for a living, and good luck to them. But I'm much more interested in what's happening on the person level and the community level there. And so to answer your question, the kind of imagery that sticks in my mind, one of the ladies that I went to visit in this area, Manchai, that we're talking about, and the main purpose I went there was to find out how these people had been able to overcome the issue of not having water. by make a life of it, by making some money, by getting food to the table for their children. One of the ladies that I visited, she'd set up, she had what had been like a shack that I described earlier, and she'd turned that shack into a dwelling that looked pretty nice, actually. But she'd made decisions to use at least half of the plot that she had to turn into a garden. And the garden had very nice shading over the top, maracuja growing, which is a lovely fruit growing over the top there. And she had rows and rows of vegetables growing in that garden. And not only was that providing wholesome food for her and her young children, she was actually preparing it and taking it to one of the richer parts of Lima and selling those vegetables and lettuce and that kind of thing on the street and getting a little bit of income. And there were people in the community that knew something about business, and they're providing that support to build a business, very small scale, but to take them out of poverty. And one of the things this lady showed me, and I've brought it back to Canada and tried it out myself in gardening, was that she was keeping all of her eggs. So she'd buy some eggs, eat the eggs, keep the shells, and she'd put them back in the boxes, and she'd use them to grow the seeds in. So she'd put some soil in, the seeds would grow, and just to see that process on a very personal level, but it was transforming their lives by making water available and making something of a small plot of land that they had.
Do you think representing that story as far as sequencing is concerned, I guess the thought I'm having is, if I look at a photograph of people, quote unquote, succeeding or finding balance in their life, is that going to promote apathy, or is it going to, promote more action? And I think on the flip side, the characterization of poor communities as these like brutalistic and suffering situations can have either elicit the same effect because it's too hard to care, or can characterize a whole diverse economy as a single character. And it's one of the pitfalls, I think, of static photography, is that, as you brought up, like a single moment has to try to encapsulate sort of a broad experience. And so a book, which you're supremely interested in, has the opportunity to try to tell a story. And it sounds like you've done documentary film work, which, film coming out of photography is the natural evolution of trying to, in its short time frame and its own bias, tell a story that might be more engaging visually. So what's your experience been like? So for example, sticking with this project, I haven't seen the book, but do you feel like you have to spend more time at the beginning where it shows sort of where they came from? Is it more important to let people know in your experience that doing all of the positive work that you and your wife and all of these other people that were involved in it has helped and given people the opportunity to fend for themselves? How have you found that process? Because we do want to talk about building books, and I think photo books have taken a bit of a loss of popularity. I don't know why. They seem to be in the realm of other photographers right now, perhaps because of social media or, streaming services where everything's on video content. But I don't know many people who are not photographers that purchase photo books. That's my own bias. It's not like I know more than a handful of human beings on the earth. Do you think that that's part of the problem, the establishment of a specific narrative, or do you think there's something else you're experiencing to relay the obviously impactful experience that you had? It sounds like an incredible life's journey to be part of these people's lives, to help them, essentially, to find themselves. How do we tell each other that this is possible?
There's a lot of things there, David, to pick up on.
Rambling.
I think this issue of building a book is clearly that's something that fascinates me, because I've really moved into making books in a big way, and it's certainly come to the point in my photographic work, which is that I don't feel a project is finished unless I actually put a book together. That I feel that that's a way of closing something out in a tangible way. and then I can move on to another thing. Now, at any moment in time, I'm working on several projects. Even now in COVID, that no travel, can't get back to Peru, so desperately want to do that to carry on my ventures and adventures and do some things that I've been planning for years. I want to go back to Britain to explore the Aire Valley and the River Aire, where I was born and bred and brought up, and just look at it, explore and document it. And I want to do those things both using photography and film and a book. I did that on my last project in Peru. I'll talk about that later. But with sequencing, it's one of the most interesting parts of making books, I do believe. But the planning is so important that you go into a project with real purpose. What do you want to achieve? How are you going to achieve it? And that gives you a structure, but also be willing to make changes depending on the consequences that are thrown up there. That you arrive in a place you've never been to. Let's talk about the Wakanada book. The Behind the Mask book. The Behind the Mask was conceived in about 2017 or so. I've worked for a few years with a dance group, a cultural group in Calgary called Raíces del Peru. And they put on dancers from Peru. And it's such a rich culture is Peru that there are many, many dancers and the music that accompanies those dancers. And I thought, having lived in Peru for 4 years, I thought I knew pretty much everything about those dancers, right? There's La Marinera, which is performed along the coast. There's the Wailash, which is performed up in the mountains. But I was exposed to this dance called the Wakanada. And it's performed by men who are dressed up with massive big cloaks, and they have wooden masks. And this dance goes back more than 500 years. And it's performed in one small town in the Andes every year, the first 3-4 days. It's now 4 days of January. So New Year's Day, and then the next 3 days. And so it's a dance that comes with tremendous heritage, tremendous cultural connection. And it's so important to the people of that community. In fact, UNESCO recognized it for its intrinsic cultural heritage. But I was fascinated by this dance that would just hit me between the eyes of like, wow, I've never heard this music. I've never seen this dance. I need to find out more. And I set in place this plan. I said, I've just got to do this. I've got to make a film about this and find out about it myself. And a year or two later, I was able to carry that off. And so I went down to Peru. The last time I was there was the end of 2018. And so I went there just after Christmas, went down on Boxing Day, actually, in 2018, and spent 2 weeks there, traveled up the mountains to this place called Mito, and had this plan to make a documentary film, to take photographs, and to have a book, ultimately, that would come out of it to show those experiences. So we turn up in the town square, and I don't know anyone there. All right, we've got a small crew there. I've got my daughter Jennifer, who's a fantastic photography assistant for me. She's worked with me a lot, so give her kudos for that. And I worked with Carla Diaz, who actually runs Raíces del Peru in Calgary. So I've known her a long time. I met up with her in Peru. She was visiting family at the time. And then I had a guy called Daniel, who's been my driver for years and years. When we lived in Peru and my son was born there and growing up, Daniel used to take my son William to school, right, when he was 2-3 years old. And so we've known Daniel for a long time, and he's worked with me, taking me to places around Peru. He's been my assistant when I've been doing photography work, providing the light and providing the logistics and the know-how. And so this small team, we turn up in the town square, but we still don't know anyone. We've got this game plan of where it's going to go. I know there's going to be dancers the next day and so on. This is New Year's Eve, right? 31st of December. And I see this fella doing some work on his wall. And for some reason, he's knocking a hole into the wall. I found out later it's to put a pole in so he can create a shade from the sun. Right? And everything came out of that. But I just went up and started to have a conversation with this fella called Medado. And 4 days later, it was like he was my best friend. It was as though I'd known him for ages and ages, for years. But it started with a conversation. And that became then a formal interview, filmed interview. And out of that came the film and then the book and the photographs that accompanied. So it's that process of, and we were talking about this at the beginning, of that personal experience, being in a new novel situation that exposes you to different situations, but be willing to work with a plan, but be flexible to move with the situation and come up with my narrative of their story about this cultural dance.
Here's the second sponsored message for this episode. If you're looking for a way to give back locally, then we should talk about the Calgary Foundation. They've been proudly supporting community needs for 65 years. When you make a gift to Calgary Foundation, it's a gift that keeps on giving. The Foundation's knowledgeable staff will provide advice on the community's most pressing needs, keeping your interests at heart and helping you give back in a way that is meaningful for you. Your contributions are invested in an endowment fund that provides a permanent source of funding, allowing you to make an impact now and forever. If you're a professional advisor creating a giving plan for a client or a donor wanting to give back to the community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org to learn more, or check out Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channel. So, after this first portion of our talk, I found myself wondering what's been holding me back from leaning into a few projects that I've had in mind. For example, my exploration of my epilepsy, which I've been building this photo book, my Perspectives Why We See project, which I meant to promote local art. Something's off, something's disconnected, I'm waiting for something. Speaking with Ashley, perhaps one of the crucial points is that I'm not being flexible or open enough. There are likely many opportunities to take a step forward, talk to another person, discover a new angle that might inspire me to move forward. This podcast, for example, simply started off as a thought but needed that push. In the end, applying for Exposure Studio of all things, meeting a world of local talent that I just had never even seen before, gave me the energy to move this thing forward. What projects are you developing, and is there anything that is holding you back? For anyone listening that has been sitting on a great idea, but has found themselves feeling apathetic or burnt out, the next step is waiting for you. Perhaps talking to a stranger, painting a wall, or simply remaining curious and flexible will help you stir the pot. Creativity, it seems, is born as much out of action as inspiration. What's the best meal you've ever had? I mean, you've traveled all around the world, so is there anything that stands out?
Well, you know, actually, Peruvian food is brilliant. And ceviche, which is lemon marinated fish and seafood. And eating that in this little restaurant called El Limon, I think it is. And it's not a tourist restaurant. It's where local people go. And every time I go back to Lima to visit or go with because my wife is from Lima as well, we go to that restaurant and we gather a few people together and have a very nice time. So ceviche is the answer.